Hi everyone, Molson here and welcome back to my recap of Game 3 of the World Championship match so far. So in this one we had Nepomniachtchi once again with the white pieces, playing the Roy Lopez. However, this one led into more of a positional game compared to the previous two. It's very unlikely that Magnus was going to repeat things and play the knight a5 sideline once again. After castles, here instead of playing h3 though, and seeing what else Magnus had in store for him, Nepomniachtchi decided to take things into his own hands and play a different anti-martial system with the move a4. Of course, this is another very popular and well-known sideline. In this position, black has a number of moves already. One I've played in the past is the move pawn to b4, which is extremely popular. There's also this rook b8 move, which recently Magnus played against Duda, and the idea is quite interesting. Black wants to reach some sort of delayed marshal. If you play c3, black will play d5, pawn takes, knight takes e5, knight takes, rook takes, c6, and we have the same as a mainline marshal with the inclusion of these exchange on the a and b file. But instead, Magnus just goes straight up with bishop to b7, which is of course the main line. After bishop b7, d3. So we get into a d3 Spanish system, pawn to d6, knight b to d2, and again Magnus has a number of different options in this position. Of course, the main move is knight to a5, and this is a very well-known line. After the move bishop to a2, play will continue pawn to c5, and this has been played a number of times by very top players, and the theory can get quite extensive from here. However, another popular line which has seen a rise in recent years is the move knight to d7. So the idea of knight to d7 is that after the move pawn to c3, black wants to play this knight to c5, and after some exchanges, sometimes he can look at perhaps playing some sort of f5 later down the track, since the bishop is off this diagonal. He can also hit out with b4, which is the main line in this position, and there have been a number of games here as well. One recent one was by Peter Svidler, who found a nice idea of sacrificing the c-pawn. After pawn takes, knight to d7, white played the move knight f1 in that game, and play continued queen a1 and knight e3. And Peter's opponent immediately went for queen takes c3, which is extremely risky. And after knight d5 was also in a lot of trouble. Rook e3, threatening rook a3, trapping the queen, and after the queen moved back already, bishop a4 led to a significant advantage for white. However, in the game, Magnus just goes rook to e8. A very classical setup here for black. So black just wants to go rook e8, bishop f8, pawn to h6 at some point. Knight to f1, so pawn to h6. Of course, bishop f8 is met by bishop g5 there. And white plays the move bishop to d2. So this idea is just to stop knight a5, so that we don't have to worry about this. And then white will develop his pieces. The knight will come to either this square or this square. We'll see this bishop d2 move has cropped up quite a bit in a number of these d3 Spanishes lately. So bishop to f8 was played, and here Nepo went for knight to e3, knight to e7, and this is one interesting moment in the game where Nepo could have gone for a very aggressive setup with the move pawn to g4 here. And this is definitely in Nepo's style, and it's very likely that both players are still in preparation here. Definitely Magnus is probably in preparation. And after the move pawn to g4, I mean, one sample line of the engine continues knight to h7, and then white can go for something along the lines of pawn to h4, let's say c5, g5, and play can get extremely messy, of course. This is something you probably wouldn't play unless you've checked it extensively beforehand with the engine, but just the top variation of the engine continues pawn takes h6, c4 takes bishop takes e4, knight h2, and just so you can see an idea of the position that might arise from this is knight takes c4, the bishop drops back, Of course, knight b6 doesn't work because queen c6 would threaten a lot of mates down this diagonal. So queen g4 is the main line, and after queen c6 we have pawn to f3 with a very messy position for both sides. Of course, I think Magnus has probably done a lot of preparation after this pawn to g4 move and is probably happy to have seen it if it was played over the board. And I think Nepo, for this match situation, didn't really want to go for this approach right now. Maybe in the blitz or rapid he might consider a slightly more aggressive approach. Instead he played some very just solid chess here with the move pawn to c4. It's a very safe, almost no risk approach. Attacking the pawn, captures, knight takes c4, knight c6 and rook c1. So it's just opening up the c file here, not creating any weaknesses in his position. Pawn to a5 was played by Magnus. So this idea is just to take away the square from white's pieces. Bishop to c3 and immediately pawn to d4. So white's just getting rid of this potentially weak pawn later on before black can think of playing d5. Also notice in a lot of positions in the Spanish where the pawn goes to d3, the bishop on b7 is often not a very good piece. And unless black is looking to play the move pawn to d5, more often than not this bishop will sort of reroute back to this diagonal anyway. Another common theme of these d3 Spanishes is that we don't want to waste too many moves because we've already wasted one with pawn to d3, so you'll not see moves such as h3 played as often. So bishop to c8, pawn to d4. We get some exchanges, queen takes d4, bishop to e6. So Magnus does have this weakness on a5, but it's very hard to attack and take advantage. Here Nepo went into a very long think and came up with the move pawn to h3. So it's a very safe, very sensible move. It's just trying to take away some potential squares from black's pieces, and just a useful waiting move, giving the king some luft. So here Magnus played the move pawn to c6, but he also had the option of going a little bit more concrete with pawn to d5. And if you look at the engine, it'll say that black is equalized after the move pawn to d5, but it does get a little bit tricky. After pawn takes, queen takes d5, queen f4, black does have to find some very accurate moves here. And for example, rook a8, bishop a2, even though everything's under control, there is some potential dangers in this position. Like the pawn on a5 is weak, and these bishops have some scope along these diagonals, and this is perhaps not what Magnus wanted. He wanted something a lot simpler where he could control the pace of the game. So he played the move pawn to c6. Understandable. Wants to go d5 next move. So bishop c2 was played, and now he went for the move pawn to d5. Of course, knight takes a5 doesn't work because black will just take it. Nepo played the move pawn to e5. And then black exchanges. If black doesn't exchange, then it becomes extremely dangerous because there's a lot of mating threats. Maybe the queen can drop back. And white can even think of pushing f4. But after the capture, we reach a position which is more or less completely equal. Of course, after take here, bishop b4 is a very accurate move to throw in. If black takes here, then white will just recapture back. So it's very important that we throw in this move. Now this bishop is stuck, and after the exchange of this bishop, we'll see that black has some threats later on of perhaps bringing the rook onto the 7th rank. So pawn takes g7, bishop takes c3. We get a lot of simplification. King takes. So the rook can jump into this d2 square, but at the moment this doesn't have enough squares to maintain it. I think white would just exchange it off. The king will also slide across when needed. So everything is under control here for white. Trades off a pair of rooks. Of course, it's much harder to dislodge the rook if it gets to b2. King f6. Rook takes. rook takes, and we have the move rook to b1 again, just trading off another pair of rooks. And the game went into a fairly harmless draw here. There's not much both players can really do. h4 does stop the king marching in here. And we got a agreed draw by both players. So pretty a quiet game from both players, and a fairly safe approach from Nippo. But it's interesting to see after the rest day what Magnus has in store with the white pieces. So thanks for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next recap. Catch you later.